Journalists such as myself are often perceived as stoic and detached from the emotions of the world around us. We are required to see the world through unbiased eyes so that we can accurately report information to you, the viewer. However, we are human and we are affected by the stories we report. In this next session, we have two high-profile journalists who will explore the importance of self-care and the impact of sharing one's story of mental health challenges. Our moderator for this discussion is Rhitu Chatterjee, a health correspondent with NPR who has a focus on mental health. She has won 2 reporting grants from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. Rhitu, thank you for your work and for joining us today.
Thank you, Jim. I'm very grateful to the Kennedy Forum for hosting this conference on a very important and timely topic. We journalists, as storytellers and communicators, obviously have a big role to play in removing stigma and improving equity in mental health. And as Jim mentioned, I cover mental health for NPR. And one of the most challenging and rewarding parts of my job is finding people who are willing to share their lived experience, either of struggling with a mental health problem themselves or taking care of a loved one who's struggling. And this is difficult precisely because of that stigma around mental illness. And it's also why it's so rewarding when people do share their story, because every story sort of chips away at that stigma and helps inform and educate people. And that brings me to our guest today, Donie O'Sullivan. Donie is a correspondent for CNN, as well as a proud Irishman. He quickly rose to fame during the January 6th riot on the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. for covering the event with great calm and poise. And he's used those skills as a reporter in many subsequent interviews, including with My Pillow CEO Mike Lindell and anti-vaccine activists. But maintaining that balanced demeanor takes effort. And Donie has been very vocal about his own challenges living with depression and anxiety. In recent months, he has used his platform to educate his colleagues and audience about the importance of mental health, both personally and professionally. Donie, thank you for being here today.
Great to be here.
So the title of the session was pulled from a quote from an interview you did with the Irish Times, and you said, quote, "I would say that the chaos that I have had in the past in my mind is far more terrifying than anything I've encountered, even at the riot that day at the Capitol." Tell us what you meant by that.
Yeah, I guess, it all comes back to if you're not feeling right in yourself, if you're sort of feeling like that you are losing it. And I certainly have felt like that, over the past 10 years or so at various times. That is what's truly terrifying, especially when you feel like you have absolutely no control, standing outside the Capitol, maybe you could run away or you could move, or you could at least feel as though you could move to a safer spot. But when you're sort of in the throes of depression or anxiety, there isn't really always a place to turn, and that can be very traumatic. It can be very, very scary, especially over a sustained period of time.
And so what motivated you to open up about your what you've struggled with?
Yeah, so I mean, especially folks in Ireland who are tuning in on January 6th, who might not have seen any of my reporting before. I think people in Ireland were quite surprised to hear a Irish voice, Irish accent outside the Capitol that day. And I guess a lot of people in Ireland just took a lot of interest and I guess pride as well in that there was an Irish reporter there. And that sort of resulted in a lot of praise on social media and attention from the Irish media, sort of saying, wow, there's this Irish guy there. He's so brave. He's so calm. He's so composed. And, as the days went on after the Capitol, I kept seeing these comments and there's requests for media interviews and things like that from Ireland. But people kept saying, oh, he's so calm. He's so calm. And I live in New York. I was on the train back to New York, I think the Sunday after January 6th, a few days after. And, it sort of struck me as people were saying, they meant well, of course, saying you're calm. But I sort of felt like, well, I'm not always calm. and that's okay. It's okay to not always be calm. And I sort of thought, particularly with my sort of 15 minutes of fame in Ireland, and there's still a bit of a stigma, of course, talking about mental health. It's gotten a lot better, but in Ireland, particularly among young men, it can be difficult to talk about. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to just sort of be honest and say, well, look, maybe I was on the surface of it, a picture of calmness on camera that night, but that's not always the case. And also I wanted to make the point that because of what I've lived through and tried to deal with depression and anxiety, that sort of actually contributed to being able to cope with what was happening on that day.
Because you had learned coping skills along the way to be able to manage your anxiety and depression. Yeah.
And I mean, I think also just in my reporting more generally, I mean, I think when you have to, I started seeing a therapist and stuff when I was in college. I had a panic attack that felt like a heart attack, and sort of things went downhill pretty quickly from there. It was a very tough time for a year or so, particularly. But I guess, you really have to, if you're trying to get to the root of this issue, you really have to look inward and ask yourself some very, very difficult questions. But I have sort of found that, by having that better understanding of yourself, being able to show empathy towards yourself, I found it's sort of been beneficial to my reporting in terms of, a lot of my job is going around the country speaking to people, to Trump supporters. And I've found that, being able to empathy, but also learning that coping with, I guess, difficult situations has sort of helped my reporting.
Yeah. So, the pandemic has certainly put a spotlight on mental health. Journalists are writing more about mental health, say, compared to 5 or 10 years ago. Employers are more interested in employees' well-being. But by and large, I think, talking openly about one's mental health, especially if one's had a diagnosis and sought treatment, is still taboo in most workplaces. And, certainly being a journalist myself, I can say that's true in newsrooms too. I'm wondering, did you have doubts about sharing your personal story? And once you did, how did colleagues react?
Yeah, I mean, truthfully, I asked some friends about whether I should do this. I felt quite strongly that I should, just because, I don't know, I just thought it was the right thing to do. I did have some friends who were saying, I don't think this is the right time to talk about it. It's a distraction from what you're doing. That's where it could have negative impact on you work-wise. When I did speak about it, I mean, everybody from the top to the bottom of the organization, colleagues at CNN, from all parts of the organization, all the way to the top, send me messages saying, well done, this is great to talk about. But that being said, I'm not sure I would have been necessarily comfortable sharing this a few years ago, maybe when I was in a more junior position. Because
where you'd have felt a little more vulnerable about your position, you're standing and still kind of early on in the profession.
Yeah. And I mean, I've had experience, I think a lot of people have had, where you come across, without naming newsrooms or different organizations, but, different managers. It can vary from manager to manager, team to team, in terms of how understanding, empathetic, sympathetic a manager might be. So I think, I guess I viewed the position I was in as one of privilege, to be able to be comfortable to share this. But I know that, frankly, probably for most people who work in newsrooms and many organizations, they wouldn't feel as comfortable talking about this.
And have you ever felt discriminated for disclosing your diagnosis or what you're going through?
No, thankfully. I mean, I think that, as I say, I had a not so great experience once with a manager, who wasn't quite as as maybe understanding as one might like to be. But, it's a difficult thing. And, I guess what I would say is the times in the past where I have had to either try and slow down or change my work routine a little bit, or eventually bring something to the attention of a manager where I say, hey, I just need to take a little breather here. That takes a terrible amount for somebody like me, but I think for most people, to have to turn around to your boss and say, hey, I have this thing going on. It can be quite traumatic actually, because you feel bad enough going to someone. You feel like, part of this illness is that you feel like a burden. You feel shit about yourself anyway. So when you...
And then having to put yourself out there and be judged by somebody else is...
Yeah, so it's definitely a thing that's I think it's such an individual thing, and it is still come down to managers. I know it's mental health's a popular thing to talk about, and I'm sure every company and newsroom has corporate policies that sound good, but it really does come down to individual managers and editors, I think.
So earlier, Bruce Shapiro from the DOT Center for Journalism and Trauma talked about resource and style guides for editorial offices and journalists. So Donie, from your perspective, what are some strategies you'd recommend to journalists when covering issues related to mental health and substance abuse, or can you think of certain do's and don'ts?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what would sometimes bug me when I'd be reading, and I mean, you're the expert here, Rhitu, so I'd be interested to hear what you think. But I mean, I've never actually covered mental health as a reporter, but one thing that sort of, I guess, bugged me as somebody who's been going through this and living this is, very often times the stories are framed as one of total recovery and overcoming this. And, in some ways, I guess my story in the Irish Times was a bit of that, but I was also trying to make very clear the point that, this isn't something always that you just shake off. Good then. I'm very...
You take a pill, go to the therapist, and you're sort of done.
Yeah, I'm very much, I know that I'm going to go through these times again. And frankly, I'm terrified that one day becomes so debilitating, I won't be able to do my job. So I think one thing that sort of bugs me was, as a person going through this, was, you'd always just read these stories of total recovery and people went on and did great things without sort of that input to say, well, they did these things, but also they were living with it. But I mean, what do you think? You're the person who covers this for a living.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because as you're telling me this, I'm thinking of course, like, mental illness is often chronic. It's something you learn to manage, and then, life throws things at you and you might struggle again. You might have to change your medication. You might have to go back for therapy. And I'm also thinking about, somebody who's been reporting on, say, suicide for the last couple of years. I also when I talk to suicide prevention researchers, when I talk to activists, or mental health advocates, I'm also told, stories of recovery are so important. Suicides that were prevented, people need to know that. People who've sort of lived with suicidal thoughts and ideation and attempts, you need to get those stories out, because for far too long, suicide has been framed as like inevitable, and people who are out there struggling need to hear these stories of recovery. So, I've been doing a lot of stories, not necessarily what you said, like somebody did this and they struggled and like they're fine now, but sometimes I think I am guilty of doing that, because I think I'm also thinking that, it is important for people who are struggling out there to know that you can get better, you can feel better. But what you're saying is a really important reminder, that to tell people that it's not sort of that clean. You can learn to manage, you can feel better, but that needn't be the end of the story. That's something I do try and sort of stay true to what the research and the data and the science says as well, that, if you've struggled with mental health, if you've had anxiety or major depression before, later on in life, if something traumatic happens or you fall upon tough times again, stress in your life goes up, you're more likely to struggle, and that's something that's come up again and again. Just in the past year, when I've reported on kids struggling with mental health challenges during the pandemic, and one of the things child psychiatrists tell me again and again, those most vulnerable are the kids who've had mental health struggles before, who've had ongoing challenges. And that's very important to get across. I agree.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that also struck me and kind of bugged me a bit and bugs me a little bit, but frankly, there's some great charity. I mean, I'm most sort of familiar, I guess, with the mental health landscape in Ireland. And there's some really good charities there doing great work. And I mean, it's a whole other story. It's the fact that it falls to charities to do so much of this work when it should be the government supporting much more of it. But, one question that to get access to a lot of these mental health services, they ask, are you suicidal? And I think that, and look, I'm not an expert, and I know there's many experts watching this, and I understand that you have to ask some sort of question to be able to get to those people that are most in need. But I think it's such a terrible question. It's such a terrible way
Why?
Because I think some people who are suicidal, some people who are really, really struggling, they don't want to admit to themselves that they're suicidal. Do you know what I mean? I think that's a terrifying thing to even, it's terrifying enough to have to turn around and seek help and admit that much to yourself.
But isn't that the first step to sort of seeking help, telling somebody you are struggling and starting a conversation?
Yes, but I guess my issue is with a lot of the mental health services that I'm aware of, they can only help you if you say you're suicidal. And I think, for me, there was just something about that to say, there was days where I was feeling very, very, very bad, and I could certainly, I wouldn't even want to admit to myself now that I might have been suicidal. There was definitely days where I thought it'd be better if this was all over. But I think it's just such a crass way of giving people access to a service or not. That being said, I don't necessarily have a solution, but I just think as we talk about this and we try to help people, some people who really, really, really do need the help and support, they might not necessarily want to turn around and say, yeah, I'm going to kill myself.
Do you think wording it in a different way, as in, have you thought of ending your life? Or
I think I think it's fine to ask the question. That's fine. But in terms of making it the benchmark for whether you can get access to a counselor or not, I think it's an issue. I think
because I know from here, it's part of the reason they ask that, I think, is to also know who needs what kind of services. Yeah. And often, I think the response to yes, I'm feeling suicidal can result in being sent off to the ER. And I know that I've had several people tell me that is, again, a reason why many people don't want to admit it, because they don't necessarily get the kind of help they need in the emergency room.
Yeah.
And what in your, what according to you is sort of journalists' role in sort of contributing to dispelling stigma and discrimination?
Yeah. Well, firstly, on the coverage, I guess, and I've never actually really covered mental health. I know you're the pro in that, but, this is probably being speaking very editorially, but I mean, most stories, even including my own, can sometimes sound a bit quite cliche. And what, in
what way?
Well, I mean, I think they're normally framed. I think a lot of mental health stories, certainly the ones that I come across online, and the stories that get a lot of attention is somebody saying, "Oh, I've done this and I've overcome it," but not a lot of stories that actually say, I've done it, I've sort of overcome it, but I'm still dealing with it and I'm terrified that it'll come back. I think sometimes mental health stories get framed as they overcame depression, they overcame anxiety, whereas I very much wanted my story to be one of, well, one, I didn't I wanted to talk about it right as I had a profile not sort of 30 years on, and sort of saying as if this was something that you have to hide. I thought that was an important message to send. But secondly, like, I mean, you know, I think a lot of reporting on mental health, and I'm in no way an expert in it, but from what I see online, it's just a lot of folks saying, you know, they got over it and it's done, rather than the approach to say, no, it can. This is a lifelong struggle, and it's not something.
It's chronic.
Yeah, it's chronic.
It's not a one hit thing that comes and goes, and it's you take a pill and then it's gone.
Exactly. Yeah. And you know, and another reason why I wanted to speak out about it was at the cusp of my 15 minutes of fame, as it were, in Ireland. You know, I would never judge any person for when they choose to speak out about this or not. I mean, it's the most inherently personal thing and you could do. But I do know that, you know, there's so many stories. You'll often see stories of folks to say, you know, oh, it's a revelation. For 20, 30, 40 years, this person that you loved or followed, whether they be a musician or a artist or whatever, has been struggling with mental health issues. And it's sort of say, wow, they did that. But it also sort of sends the message that I think there's something to hide. So I sort of intentionally wanted to just talk about this, particularly in Ireland, because I'm, you know, from a rural part of Ireland, where there's been a lot of suicides, a lot of young male suicides. And, you know, I was very scared when I first started to experience this stuff, or knowing what I was going through in college. You know, I was terrified to even admit to myself that it could be depression or anxiety. And then it took a very long time before I could tell people or tell friends. And every time I'd do it, it would feel like a massive moment. But as the years went by, I became much more open about it. And as you know, I wasn't shouting it from the rooftops. I wasn't going to the Irish Times like I eventually did this year. But, you know, if I sensed somebody was going through something, I wouldn't hide it, and I'd talk about my experience. But even with that, you know, after my piece in the Irish Times published, some of my closest friends, male friends, still came to me and they said, oh, I didn't know you were going through that sort of thing. I think I've had something like that too. So there's just so much value in talking about it and being open about it.
And it's interesting that you bring up a gender aspect as well. I think men, by and large, and this is something that I've learned as a reporter as well, it's more of a taboo for men to disclose their struggles, I think, in a lot of cultures, definitely this one, than I think women.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I will say, you know, I've always had a really great relationship with my parents. They're great. They're both in Ireland. But, you know, I always sort of, when I started to go through this thing in college, and I came home on Christmas and I knew I had to try and get this sorted out. So I told both my parents. I always knew my mom would get it, totally understand it. For some reason, in my mind, I just thought my dad, he's a great dad, but you know, I just didn't necessarily think he would get it. You know, I thought maybe he'd say, oh, you know, you'll be okay, you'll be able to shake it off. But he really, really did. And as I thought about it more, I was sort of like, well, of course he did. I mean, he's lived in that part of rural Ireland all of his life. He's seen probably dozens of people he knew over the years take their own lives. So, you know, I think even my own thinking of how accepting or understanding fellow men would be about it, I think evolved.
So what did he say when you first told him, and how did he respond? What was his response?
I mean, he was very much like, well, let's get you the help that, you know, you need to get. Let's, whatever you need, we'll try and do that. And, you know, it was just very supportive and encouraging. I mean, I think the nightmare scenario for somebody in that situation, which I know happens, is if somebody does tell you, oh, shake it off, or what you have to worry about, because that's sort of devastating. And that, you know, very much, fortunately, wasn't the case for me. But, you know, I do say to people that, you know, it's can take a terrible amount energy and confidence to turn around and to confide in somebody that you're going through this.
Especially when you're struggling.
Yeah.
When you're in the middle of it.
Yeah. And, if you get, sometimes you can go to your best friend or you can go to a loved one that you think will really get it, and they won't. But I always say, like, somebody will, somebody else in your life will get it. And I mean, I will say, I think it is a hard thing I sort of understand why some people sort of naturally say, oh, you'll be okay, you can shake it off. Because if you haven't, it's a very, very hard thing to, I think, comprehend or appreciate if you haven't gone through it. I mean, I will say, even when I was an undergrad in college, this was sort of before I knew I was going through stuff. Like, there was a student welfare office, and I would be in the college newspaper, and I never sort of appreciated, I think, in my mind, what actual services and how important the services they were offering, because I never really had to comprehend it, or deal with it, So it's a tough one. It's tough on all sides.
So your parent support clearly mattered a lot to you. Was there any other person support that really sort of made a big difference? Because I know that social support, is so key. Like, social isolation can increase the risk of mental health issues, depression, anxiety, and can also feed into it. So I'm wondering who else was supportive that really sort of made a difference to you.
Yeah, I mean, I have some very good friends now that when I am sort of experience ups and, because I mean, my point is, fortunately, I've not been in a very dark spot in a while. But there are times where, there's those bumps in the road. So I'm lucky now that I have some great friends that get it, that know about it, that we talk about it, and things like that. And that is, that's a huge part of it. I was also very lucky that in my college, I was able in university to get support and get a counselor. That's not always the case for everybody. You can't always get access to in-person mental health support. So, that's the sort of other tragedy, I think, in a lot of this is, even when some people do go desperately looking for help, it's not the professional help isn't always there.
Yeah, definitely hear a lot about that in my reporting. So before we go, if you could give our viewers one piece of advice that they can do to address stigma around mental health and substance use disorders, what would it be?
I think it's about being sympathetic, empathetic. It's about just thinking about it more, I guess. It's very, again, it's one of those things that it's hard to truly appreciate it if you haven't gone through it. But, if you go back and think about when you're at your lowest ebb, and think about how it would feel if you felt like that all the time or for a very, very long time, and how difficult it would be to go about your day, go to work, interact with people, if you were in that state constantly, because that's, I guess, what it's sort of like. And you can't just shake it. So I guess it's sort of just thinking about it in that way, especially if you're a boss or a manager, to be able to say, okay, I can understand that this can be quite debilitating. But I mean, I think it's great that we're talking about it more. And, people, I think, get it a lot more now than they might have before. But obviously there's a long way to go.
Thank you, Donie, for sharing your experiences and for being with us here today.
Thank you.
And for everything that you've done to shine a light in mental health.
Thanks.